My name is Josh Ellis. I'm Vice President of the Metropolitan Planning Council. I'm also a member of the Midwest Advisory Council for the National Parks Conservation Association. So on behalf of both groups who partnered together to produce this event, I want to thank everyone for being here. Thank our speakers, Cam, Amir, and Sandra, and thank Justin, who's going to be moderating for us. This is, what are we in the second week of February? This is, I think, the fourth or fifth public event that MPC has already had in 2018, so we're busy at work. We like to affect policy change and policy development here in the region, and one of the ways we do that is by informing public discourse and dialogue about big issues. So last week we had an event on the future of autonomous vehicles. We also were out in Naperville for a release of a new guide we have for elected officials called Drinking Water 123. The week before, which Danielle has copies of for anyone that would like it. It's meant for folks who have been recently elected to office, may not come from a water management background, and suddenly have to provide drinking water to often thousands of people. The ins and outs of how to do that safely. The week before that, we were down in Blue Island for an event celebrating the CalSag Trail and community-led efforts there to develop that amenity, and they were the winners of our Burnham Award for Excellence in Planning last year. So frequent events like this, bringing together people, multiple stakeholders, multiple parts of the region for this sort of public discourse. And I should note that on your chairs, hopefully not on your chairs at this point, hopefully you picked them up and are not sitting on them, there is a list of some future events. These are just a handful of things that are already on the calendar, on the books, a wide variety of formats. One of the things we like best about these events is the range of perspectives and folks that are here. And so I have a brief exercise. I'm going to ask that as I call out folks, please use your non-sandwich hand to self-identify here. We don't need any onions flying around the room. So non-sandwich hand in the air. We have a whole host of folks here who are either former or current federal government employees in some way, shape, or form. Just a quick show of hands. Thank you all for coming out and for your service. We have a smaller handful who are actually congressional staff to a couple of our senators and representatives here. So just a quick show of hands if you're congressional staff. They're in the back, not appearing to hide at all. We have a lot of folks here from regional, local, or county government. Again, just a quick show of hands. Fantastic. Thank you very much. Folks from architecture, planning, design, engineering, construction. Quick show of hands. Some folks that work for some of our region's great philanthropies and support the work of ourselves and National Parks Conservation Association. Quick show of hands. And for anyone who's just a generally concerned citizen wanting to know what's going on with our air, land, and water, quick show of hands. Hopefully that's everybody, but okay. In addition to that, we also have some media in the room, including a couple of gentlemen here from the Russian government who wanted to keep tabs on things. There they are with the cameras. They're actually making a documentary about the Great Lakes, and so we're here to cover this. So we welcome you guys, and there's a couple of other reporters in the room as well, including our own moderator, Justin, is going to come up in 2 seconds. This event that you're at right here is the first in a series. We'll be having events later in the spring and then in the summer about other areas where federal policy is affecting systems we rely on. So look for events coming up about hard infrastructure, roads, pipes, energy systems, and then community systems, health, housing later in the year. So. With that, I want to turn it over to Justin, who's going to share a couple thoughts, moderate, and invite our speakers up to give a series of presentations, and then we'll have ample time for Q&A. And throughout, you'll see, as we introduce different people, Twitter handles. If you are on Twitter and want to be part of a discussion that way, we give you every prompt you need to do that. So thank you all for being here. Justin, take it away.
Thanks, John. Hi, everybody. My name is Justin Kaufman, and I am the host of The Download on WGN Radio. It airs every night, Monday through Friday, 7 to 11, when there is not a sporting event that will preempt us, like tonight, and tomorrow, and Monday, and Wednesday, and Thursday. No, I joke. We love the Blackhawks, and we love maybe a random sports baseball team coming up here. All right, so I'm on my show, it's a talk show, and we have a lot of discussions, and we talk about the news of the day, but more importantly, we talk about Chicago, and we talk about the region. We have discussions that are pertinent to the issues as citizens that we have to confront each and every day. That's why I love my relationship right now with the Metropolitan Planning Council. It has been one that I've had for a long time. I worked at WBEZ, the NPR station here in Chicago, for 20 years. Used a lot of MPC people throughout the years. But when I moved over to WGN, Mary Sue and I talked about what we could do to have conversations about the big ticket items of our region in a way that was accessible. And we continue to do that with people from MPC, and we've had a lot of people in this room have been guests on the program talking about the issues that are up here that we're going to talk about today, but other things like transportation. We've talked about racism, we've talked about segregation, we've talked about a number of different issues, and I always walk away from those conversations knowing more about the city that I live in, but also understanding that there's a lot more we have to do as a society to come together and tackle these things. It to me is the lifeblood of why we do a show like The Download. It is to try and bring people together and talk about big issues. These three issues tonight, air, land, and water, I mean, these obviously we all understand how important they are, and after a year of a new administration, they still dominate the headlines every single day. Every day that I prepare for a show, there will be news stories about our air quality, news stories about water, of course, the national parks. All these things continue to be at the forefront of our media coverage when it comes to our show. And so today, I think this is a perfect way for us to continue the conversation. I love what the Planning Council is doing. And I'm not going to spend too much time talking any further because the people we have presentations about the areas that they're in. I plan to have conversations with Sandra and Amir at some point. We're planning that. We just had a conversation with Josh and Cam on the show last Friday, and I was surprised to find, I didn't know this, that our country does not have a national water policy. And that's something that came out of, it wasn't necessarily what we were supposed to talk about, and it came out of, and we started to discuss what that means and why we don't, and why it's not working state by state, and all of this, of course, in the looming story about Cape Town, South Africa running out of water by April. But that is a conversation that we have to have, and we have to find a way to spark our citizens through media to talk about these things so that our government can understand that these are important issues. So without further ado, why don't I just turn it over. We're going to have a conversation after the presentations, and of course a Q&A, which you guys will lead. Why don't we start? Cam, you going to start us off? Cameron Davis, everybody.
Great, thanks Justin, and thanks to all of you for being here. Thanks to MPC for helping to coordinate this great event. We do need the discussions. There are a lot of changes going on right now that affect us all. Let me mention to you too, if you're not following on Twitter, Aquavate, @Aquavate is how you can do it. I'm posting stuff almost all the time about the things we care about, the water we drink, the water we swim in, the waters we fish from, and all of the changes that are going on. And it's aqua as in water, vate as in advocate, which I hope all of you are. And we'll do our best to keep your education going today so you can keep being great advocates for water. So I'll probably be the shortest of all of the presentations today, because if there's one thing that I've learned over the past 30 years, it's that the shorter you speak, at least for me, the more people pay attention. So let me break my thoughts down into three categories. One of them is threats. Another is opportunities. I'll cover that last. And then there are things that are a little bit of both, and I'll cover that too. So on the threats, one of the things that we, and I come from the environmental world, one of the things that we as folks in the environmental field think about a lot is policy. I know I'm a policy geek. I am a proud policy geek, and so I think in terms of policy geekness. One of the things that we are seeing, and this is no surprise to anybody here, is a rollback on the federal level of many of the most important public health protections that are out there. And I think of nature as a form of infrastructure. So when we see policies being rolled back, like trying to make clearer delineations between where federal protections begin and end, and where state and municipal protections begin and end, when that becomes blurred, those kinds of changes have real life consequences for water, the water that we care about. And that's what we're seeing with the rollback of what's called the waters of the U.S. or WOTUS. When I was in Washington, everybody loved to talk about WOTUS. You know, it rhymes with POTUS and SCOTUS and all the other tusses that are out there. But waters of the U.S. was the federal effort under the Obama administration to clarify where federal jurisdiction begins and ends. Very, very important, because if there's not a federal presence as a backstop, if states or municipalities don't do their job, then the job doesn't get done. We've usually had a federal presence as kind of a safety net. So we're seeing a rollback of that with no real replacement in mind for what might come next. Other things to look at are things like the lead and copper rule, which has been very confusing since it was written in the early 1990s, and which I think shares a fair amount of blame for things like the crisis in Flint, Michigan. When we don't have clear federal rules, those are the kinds of things that unfortunately happen. And if you have an administration that is not real keen on federal rules and using that as a mechanism for protecting public health, we suffer, and kids suffer. When you look at lead contamination, that's the kind of thing that really hits kids very hard. Another thing to look at are rollbacks when it comes to toxics, whether they're coming from the air or directly discharged to the water. Again, if we don't have those federal protections, it hurts us all. Those are some of the policy-related rollbacks that have been happening on the federal level since January 20th of last year. But there are other things that are just as important. I'd say even more important that are institutional and not hitched to a particular policy. One of them is budgets. Now, who here wakes up at 4 a.m. because you're anxious to write that letter about a federal budget? Oh my God. 2 of you. I love you. I want to get your autograph after this. Not many of us, because budgets are boring. We can't afford for them to be boring anymore. Because with budget cuts to, for example, the EPA, which is a heroic agency that does heroic things virtually every day, again, when they don't have the resources to do their work, whose health is jeopardized? I'll give somebody a chance to answer that question. Everybody's, right, good. Yeah, you all get the award. Everybody's health is jeopardized. And personnel is important too. Without budgets, it's hard to pay people to do their jobs. And we have a lot of dedicated people within EPA and other agencies that are looking at cutbacks. And there have been a lot of retirements lately. Again, there is a direct connection between these kinds of rollbacks, be they substantive policy rollbacks or institutional rollbacks like personnel and budget that impact us. So those are, in a nutshell, some of the threats. The in-between category, I think the thing to watch is infrastructure. We haven't seen a lot of detail coming out of Washington over what an infrastructure plan might look like, but we've heard and seen enough to know that it's probably more ambitious than it can deliver in the next year to 2 years or in the coming years. And we also know enough to know that the private sector is being contemplated as a part of the equation. I can tell you what I hope that doesn't mean. I hope that doesn't mean we are looking at more privatization of key municipal and state and public assets. There has to be a really, really good reason to look at privatization of those kinds of assets, and it's hard to find those kinds of justifications out there. But watch for the federal plan and how much can truly be paid for by the feds or would be paid for by the feds, meaning Congress, versus how much is being tagged for state participation, being tagged for private contributions, because who funds what becomes a very important question as well for public health. But it is not all doom and gloom. As much as I am stunned and almost horrified by what we are seeing coming out of Washington, I do think that there are some opportunities too. And one of the opportunities is a chance for the private sector to begin to step up. We have seen this in the energy world, where, yes, federal rules that have been proposed can help push the energy generation portfolio in a certain direction, but can we see that kind of investment when it comes to water? We haven't seen it yet. And I'm not sure what shape or form it might take, but I do think it's a matter of time before we start to see the private sector begin to step up to push for water quality protections, even water quantity protections, much like they have tried to do by becoming players in the renewable energy world. And the other really good news, I think, is something called the Great Lakes Restoration Initiative. Some of you may know about that here in the room, but it is a federal investment started in the Obama years at about $300 million per year that goes towards keeping Asian carp out of the Great Lakes, helping to reduce phosphorus and nutrient pollution, rebuilding habitat, also cleaning up our toxic hotspots, things like that. It was started under a Democratic administration. It is now being fully funded under a federal government that's fully controlled by the Republicans. That's very good news, and it speaks to what I think is a very strong sense of bipartisanship when it comes to water assets like the Great Lakes. And I know that many of you in this room, whether it's MPC, MPCA, the Alliance for the Great Lakes St. Lawrence Cities Initiative, many of these organizations are doing wonders to make sure that those kinds of investments keep moving forward, because they are budget geeks too. So that's it for now. I'll keep it very short. I look forward to the questions, but thanks for following Aquavate. And I really appreciate you guys being here today. Nothing moves forward without you all being interested and engaged. Thanks.
Hello, everybody. Thank you for coming. It's a pleasure to be here. My name is Amir Gina. I'm an assistant professor at the Harris School of Public Policy at University of Chicago. It's a little bit of unusual training in both climate science and economics, so I'm viewing this from a view of the issues that I think about through both a natural science view and then an economic or even a policy wonk type of view. Depends on who you ask. So I'm here today to talk a little bit about the air aspect of this, of what's happened in the past year. And there's three things that I want to talk about, two of them relating directly to air quality and policy related to the air. And then one which I'd like to touch on, as Cam also mentioned, about budgetary issues and funding. But I'll focus a little bit more on the science and the research side for that. So I think you could ignore this for a moment, and I'll just give some background. So there was one of the crowning achievements in global climate policy for the past few years has been the Paris Accord. So this was a set of, just starting a timer for myself so I don't go too long. This is a set of non-binding commitments where almost every government in the world, barring Syria, who didn't have the capacity to do it, and Nicaragua, who didn't feel like the agreement went far enough, to reduce their carbon emissions to a certain level which they stated themselves that was within their capacity. And every country voluntarily said they would do this. It was non-binding. They didn't have to. The current administration has advanced the rhetoric on rolling back that deal. In a way, if they were unhappy with it, the easiest thing to do would have been just to ignore it, as they could do. There would have been no punishment for that. This has two problems, one indirect and one direct. So I think the indirect one is that given current economic trends, emissions will continue to decline in wealthier countries. Developing countries are trying to commit to lowering the intensity that they're increasing their emissions for each unit of GDP that they produce. But the US has always played a strong leadership role in any of these negotiations. In fact, it was the Obama administration who, along with commitments from China, really led to the ability of every country through consensus to say we're going to deal with this as a problem. And the US voice has been incredibly important, either in holding it back or advancing this agenda globally. And by abdicating all leadership within this problem, I think it sends a dangerous signal to other countries around the world that this is something that we shouldn't care about. So that's a big issue. Why would we care about it here in Chicago, in Illinois, in the Great Lakes region? The part of the research that I do is thinking less about this as a global issue that abstractly affects temperatures in some average sense around the world, but thinking what that translates to in terms of local impacts. So on this set of maps here, if everyone can hear me, I'll just raise my voice. We're looking at impacts from different sectors, from increases in temperature, under a business as usual type of scenario. So we continue emissions, so agriculture, mortality, and energy. And that's what I want you to focus on, these top 3 ones. So if you look at Illinois and the Great Lakes, you'll see first that there's this big pattern of worse damages in the southern United States, and maybe even some benefits in the northern United States. Illinois sits somewhere in between those. So particularly for energy, mortality impacts, and agricultural impacts, there are expected to be, by the end of the century, and even by the mid-century, some pretty large effects on the local economy here because of continuing to increase our carbon dioxide emissions. So the signaling of pulling out, the policy signal to the rest of the world of pulling out of this agreement will have local effects if people start to follow suit, if this becomes less of a priority. So thinking about that, trying to localize this issue, it's not something that is only affecting someone in a far-off, poor or vulnerable country. This is something which has quite large effects in the local area. 2 of the pieces that were related, which bring this again a little bit more locally, 2 of the pieces that were related to the efforts to reduce carbon emissions were the Clean Power Plan, which the administration has effectively repealed, and the social cost of carbon, which I'll talk about in a moment. So one reason for optimism, perhaps, is that even with this view of the US saying that it's no longer interested in climate change or engaging in climate change as a global problem, the Clean Power Plan was meant to reduce the emissions in the US. That was the centerpiece of the policy that would reduce our emissions here. It turns out because of market forces, because of the trends within the economy, particularly low gas prices and increasingly low or decreasing costs of renewables, we're probably going to get to the goal that would have been set through the Clean Power Plan anyway. So the red line here done by some colleagues at the the blue line done by from an analysis from some colleagues at the Rhodium Group, which is an energy research firm, looks at what the trends are in US emissions with a couple of scenarios about what's going to happen to gas prices, etc., and sees that we're basically hitting right at that 32% decrease line that the Clean Power Plan was mandated to bring us down to. So in a way, that policy has been overtaken by events. It's not necessarily the largest tragedy that the Clean Power Plan is up on the chopping block. The difference between the status quo here with reductions in emissions and what would have happened under the Clean Power Plan is that the distributional effect will be different. It set targets at the state level for reductions in emissions, and some states were doing very well, some states were not doing very well, and they were allowed to trade. That mechanism's gone. So we'll see some places remain more polluting than they would have otherwise. So that's kind of the climate piece. Well, one other thing that I think has been rolled back, which is a number that, the most important number that many people have never heard of, is the social cost of carbon. So a measure of what the damages are from a ton of carbon emitted. The current administration has not rolled back any policy on that. There's still a finding from the Supreme Court that says if it's causing health damages, we need to put a value on it. But they have effectively turned down the dial to set the number to 0. This matters for planning decisions everywhere. Cost-benefit calculations are supposed to take that into account. There's been regulations relaxed, saying that you don't need to do your cost-benefit calculations for building a power plant or something along those effects with the same rigor. But it has also set the damages from the emissions effectively to zero, which is not a recognition, not supported by the science. So that's something which could have effects on local policies happening here. So in speaking about this and jumping a little bit to air pollution, one of the benefits, the co-benefits of the Clean Power Plan and the social cost of carbon was that it would change investments in local factories, in local power plants. There's a whole suite of regulations under the Clean Air Acts that some of which are being relaxed, some of which aren't, which aim to look at local level pollution from manufacturing. The benefits from these regulations have been enormous. So the Office of Management and Budget, in a report a few years ago, tallied up the total benefits that came from the Clean Air Acts alone between 1970 and 1990 and found it to be about $22 trillion. That's more than the benefits from every other federal regulation put together. So these are things which make economic sense. The reason they make economic sense, and this is kind of a broad point I want to make, is that when we think about environmental damages and pollution, we're fundamentally thinking about externalities. I, as the owner of a factory producing something, am making money, but in the process of doing that, I'm harming the health or well-being of people close to where I'm producing things. There has been a focus in this administration on listening to the producers who will definitely face who do face costs of regulations, at the expense of listening to the people who are suffering from those externalities. That number from the OMB would suggest that it makes perfect economic sense for the national economy to think about those regulations and think of the full cost benefit of those. That's currently something which is suffering under in the past year. And then the final point that I want to make, again, touching on funding. So I'm from Ireland. I moved here for the reason that many people move to the US, which is because it has, among other things, the greatest system of graduate education anywhere in the world. I was drawn here for that. I, not being a citizen, wasn't able to get National Science Foundation funding myself, but many projects that I started working on at the start, often for free, were funded by the National Science Foundation. A lot of my training, my view on the world, my view on research, came from publicly funded sources. There has been a worrying trend recently where when I've tried to, now that I'm a faculty member, I'm allowed to get this funding, which has been an enormous benefit, but if I put the word climate into any of those proposals, they will instantly get rejected. And we've been warned that that's the case. So what I'm seeing here is, along with the idea of budgets being cut, in a way, regulatory rollbacks are one thing, but if we reduce the ability of agencies to monitor the environment, then pollution can still increase and we can't do anything about it. But thinking about the research point of view, if we reduce the funding in research now, we're also destroying the ability to train people for the next generation. And this is a gap that we will notice, I think, in 10, 20 years down the line, as people aren't going after the earth science type of projects, which have filled in all this information. And that's not just broad global things, that's local things about water pollution here, the effects of air pollution. So I think it's kind of a crisis. And to end on an optimistic note, there's been a fantastic movement within the US, and the group that I work for, called the Climate Impact Lab, has actually started partnering with the US Climate Alliance. So it's a group of states and municipalities who have decided unilaterally decided they will adhere to their goals under the Paris Accords. This, first of all, sends a great message to the rest of the world that people in the US still care about the environment in this way. Chicago has been a particularly strong voice in that alliance, as it has been in a number of other issues related to air quality, but generally the environment, thinking about things like green infrastructure, what to do with storm water management. There's opportunities in Chicago to deal with issues of environmental justice that have it uniquely placed as a potential leader in this, not just for the US, but also for other parts in the world. And I think there's an opportunity here which would be kind of a drastic thing to miss, considering where we're sitting at the moment with the federal environment as it is. So I think that's all I'll say for now, and thank you. And I'll leave it to Sandra.
Well, good afternoon. I'm really glad to be here. I'm going to follow Amir's advice or action and take my watch off so that I'm paying attention, because I have like an hour and a half. I hope you guys are prepared. And I know I only have like 8 minutes, so I'm going to do my very... Josh is going, no, I have 8 minutes. And I don't see the there, no. Thank you. Oh, you took this away. All right. I have no slides. First, I'm going to tell you that I'm going to have quite a few slides to begin with that are wordy. I apologize, but I have so much that I wanted to share. I'm going to try and go through them very, very quickly so that we can move to the pretty pictures and we can talk about things that might be a little less disappointing. I spent my career devoted to working on national parks and monuments, these places I care deeply for. And I'm a planner, and I spent a lot of time in environmental compliance. I will not spend so much time talking about NEPA. I, too, love policy and could get immersed in it. I'm going to talk a little bit about where I think the administration's priorities are when it comes to federal land management, most specifically with parks and monuments. And how I think the budget has started to impact. And then I'm going to end on national monuments, because those are the things that hit the news. Those are the things we see almost every day. So we'll do that. So there's been a lot of conversation about where the administration puts their time. And I want to tell you that I think it's primarily energy independence and economic growth, and then reducing the size and the scope of government, which also includes decreasing the regulations, as Cam and Amir have talked about, improving the efficiency of permitting, and then the biggie that it's hard to imagine the Secretary is going to focus on, which is reorganizing the entire Department of the Interior. From a distance, from a height of 34,000 feet, none of these things seem all bad. I mean, economic growth is a good thing. Energy independence has its up points. I think we lose some value in not being able to negotiate. If we don't need anybody else's energy, why do we have to talk to other people? But if we can focus, but if we focus our attention on building our own energy capacity, it also means that something has to be diminished. I mean, we have to take our eye off of conservation and environmental quality. And this administration has put together, has issued 58 executive orders in the last 13 months. It's not necessarily a high number, but they are focused they're focused in concentrated areas. I think that there's 10 or 12 of these executive orders that are going to have direct negative impacts on national lands. And primarily, I am concerned with national parks and monuments. And some of them deal with something as simple as broadband, rural broadband. So you say, oh, we want to support rural broadband. That's a great thing. It's going to help drive economics in areas that really need it, except for the fact that this executive order is asking that broadband facilities be built on federal property, primarily Department of Interior property, and there's no exception for national parks. So then, lots more cell towers and other facilities can be built in areas that should have been set aside and were in fact set aside for their conservation values. So I think about that. I think about the indirect impacts of asking the Department of the Interior to stand aside from their regular work and participate in a reorganization. There's nothing that's going to be a motivator, a killer of morale and motivation, than to tell a group of employees that are already under pressure because there's fewer of them, because the budgets have been cut. Instead of keeping your eye on your agency's mission, we want you now to worry about whether or not your job will exist in the next reorganization. And if you have to uproot your family and move them into the new 13 regions the Secretary would like to create, so that how agencies have organized themselves for good reason, and some are silly, but they're historical. But if you say, I'm going to take all the agencies, and instead of having the Park Service have their 7 regions and their 7 regional directors who knows what's happening in their areas, and you say, no, you're going to be split into 13 regions So you go, great, well, then they have maybe more on the ground, except for they may not be led by someone who's skilled in national parks. They need to be led on a rotating basis where tomorrow your leader for the next couple of years is someone from Bureau of Mining. And then the next time it's someone who's Fish and Wildlife Service. So you don't know whose expertise is going to be leading you, and there is a problem. Because every job can't be done by every person, and every agency's mission is legislated for a particular purpose. And I think the National Park Service mission to care for places in such a manner as to leave them unimpaired for future generations is a valiant mission, and really should be done by people who have the education, the expertise, and to do that work. So that's what I think. I don't think the administration and I agree necessarily. A friend of mine actually someone I've never met sent me a screenshot from a meeting. And this is the Secretary's top 10 priorities. In the fall, the Secretary sent these out, and different agencies in the department got to take a look at what the Secretary wanted to work on. Now, the first one, I love the first one, because he wants to have a conservation record equal, basically to Theodore Roosevelt. Well, Theodore Roosevelt, in his time as president, set aside over 230,000 acres into the public domain for conservation reasons. Those are national parks and monuments, wildlife refuges. I don't necessarily see the administration moving in that direction, but I'm just going to call out a few things. So one of the priorities is utilizing natural resources. The next one is generating additional income. All right, so if you're focused as the Secretary and you're asking all the agencies in the Interior to focus in on utilizing resources, so being more extractive. So this shows up in reducing the regs on oil and gas. We've always been able, if there is an existing mineral right owned by someone, they've always been able to exercise that in a national park. But now they're saying, let's reduce even the rules that you're allowed to put on them, so that we can encourage them to get in there and, take advantage of that lease. And then, of course, there's the fees. I'm bouncing wildly. So then there's the fee increase, because that's going to really raise a lot of revenue, except for the Secretary in issuing the fee increase didn't say exactly how much revenue was forecasted. And if you are only raising the fees at parks that already have an entrance fee, but only the most popular of those parks, and only during the highest visitor season, how do you know what the impact of raising those fees will be? There is, of course, the instantaneous effect on families who are budgeting for family trips and have planned, we're going to go here, here, and here, and they find out that here and here the fee just went up double, triple. All right, so maybe they have to make a different choice. Or maybe instead they do a little bit more planning and they buy a park pass. Well, when you're paying an entrance fee for a park, your money primarily goes in that park. When you buy the whole national park pass, it no longer goes to that park, it goes to the agency. And then what's the purpose for generating more revenue? And then what do you do with sites that don't charge an entrance fee? Do they have less value because they're not generating more revenue? Most of the sites don't have entrance fees. All right. Okay, regulatory balance and infrastructure. And I think my colleagues have already spoken a little bit about what that means. And I worry about all the pressures on that. And budget. I don't have anything else to say about budget except for what's on the screen. The Park Service just celebrated 100 years. We've just encouraged visitors to come into the parks in droves. We've given fourth graders a free pass to share with their families, and the budget is being cut. National monuments. When the president said that he was going to look at national monuments to resize them or change their protections, I immediately thought of Pullman, because I spent so much time, and with many of you here, working on the Pullman designation, and I was really momentarily pleased that Pullman wasn't on that list of 27. But that's only momentary, because if the president can come after one, he can come after them all. And we look at national monuments, whether they're managed by the National Park Service or the Bureau of Land Management or the United States Forest Service, that all of them have been set aside for a specific reason, and that is their long-term preservation. And so it pains me to know that, and these photos that I'm showing you are of the 10 who have been set aside for changes. And for each time that they have either changed the boundaries to reduce the number of acres, they have also changed what can happen within their boundaries. So they've changed the level of protection for extractive resources. So this opens up these places for commercial logging and fishing and mining and drilling. And once broken, they can't be fixed. You can't put these places back together again. The last slide I'm going to leave you with is a trailer for another conversation at another time. One of the, three of the presidential memorandum that have been put out have to do with pipelines and making it easier for pipelines to be built. We all benefit from pipelines. I mean, whether it's natural gas to markets or the infrastructure work that gets traffic safely over bridges, over rivers. But that's the kind of work that, though it needs to happen, should be happening with a real eye on how to maintain conservation values. And there's a whole system, hundreds of rivers in the National Wild and Scenic River System. And that emphasis on pipelines and infrastructure has the ability to increase the workload in that area to such an extent that the few employees who have that job to help in permitting are overwhelmed. Thank you for letting me talk just a little bit, and I'm glad that I got through it.
So what I hear is surge pricing at the dunes. That's what I just heard there. Great. That's for us in Chicago. I can understand that. All right. So we thought now we'd open it up to a conversation. We start. I'll lead a conversation, and we can talk, take questions from the audience as well. Listening to all of your presentations, your great presentations, it does strike me that all of them seem to center around the idea of restructuring government in a way that really comes down to how much resources are going to be put into these areas when it comes to the EPA or to the Parks Service and even other places in between. But when we talk about, is it restructuring government first, meaning restructuring budgets and essentially saying we want to reduce the size of government? Is it that before philosophy? Is it that before changing the way that this administration looks at our environment? I mean, you hear it so many different ways that, you know, the administration, the EPA has an interest in more corporations or, like you said, the producers. But is it really truly at the beginning just about reducing the size of government? Whoever wants to take that.
Well, this is Cam. I'll go ahead and take a shot at it. I really do think it's about reducing the size of government, and it's not about doing things better, faster, smarter, because if it were, you would see a proposal to say cut here or there preceded by some kind of an alternative that would get you to some baseline of public health protection, and we often don't see that. We just see kind of the message of we want smaller government. It's not more effective government, it's smaller government. And I don't think the size of the government is really the issue. It really is, it's the public health protection, it's the open land imperative, things like that needs to come first. And then you walk backwards from there to figure out how to best get to those
But
goals.
as Sandra just said, which I find interesting, is that if you start to cut the budget and you start to cut and reorganize the way that the Parks Service works, there ultimately will be decisions that have to be made about what part of the mission that the Park Service is actually going to address and protect.
Well, the secretary will say that he thinks that national parks are wonderful, and the president said, oh, we want to keep the parks open during the government shutdown because, I don't know. I think that on I don't think philosophy has much to do with it. I do agree with Cam that this is really about reducing the size of government. And I think when he's talking about land management issues, land policy issues, I think that he is being led by a Western mindset. There are a lot of folks that he goes to for advice that all come out of the Mountain West and have the idea about, we just have to have less, and they're focused on interior, but I don't necessarily think it's national parks. I think national parks is taking the brunt of it. I think that they have issues with the Bureau of Land Management, or the Forest Service, or the Fish and Wildlife Service, and it just so happens that national parks get caught up in that.
When we talk about, obviously pulling back on regulations, budgets are attached to that as well. And Amir, I'm interested when it comes to this idea of self-policing. We hear this a lot. And your Clean Power Plan slide is that. At the idea that the Trump administration believes that the industry that is producing energy can self-police, meaning the consumer will drive regulation, the consumer will drive a better environment. Is that, it seems to be working in the sense that, we're going to get to the levels of what the Clean Power Plan was going to get to in the first place.
So I think that's maybe an optimistic view of how they're viewing the Clean Power Plan, to put it politely. Had they made these same assumptions, had they understood what was happening with the markets, they might have thought differently about scrapping this. They might have just left it in place, something else. I think what they were viewing was that this was an illegal regulation, and the EPA should not be in any way involved with regulating the energy system in this way, because it's carbon as opposed to another criteria pollutant. The rhetoric that comes from the energy independence, energy dominance, whatever the term that they use is much more towards let's revive fossil fuels, let's revive coal. That graph of the decline in emissions is probably not something that would make them happy. They would want to reverse that trend, I think, and that's what the rhetoric suggests. The actual policy making to back up that rhetoric, I don't think has been as targeted, which would imply, in the same way that Cam has said, that really the motivation appears less targeted towards let's set these policy goals and make them occur through thinking cleverly about policy, and more just let's get rid of regulation because that means we need to spend less on government.
Cam, in our conversation, one of the things that came out when we were on the radio was that water is a bipartisan issue. And if you go down the line to representatives in both chambers, they will all, on all sides, water is important to the future of our lives. Where does it get caught up in politics? Where does water conservation policy and everything we talk about get caught up in the web that is Washington?
Yeah, I think you're hearing a lot of it here today. It's about who's responsible and what's the best approach for protecting water. So the best approach you often hear is, say, a free market system. It is where you essentially you take the regulatory protections or framework out of the mix, and you let the market do what it's going to do for purposes of protecting or not natural resources. And then the who does it part is, and you tend to see this in code. You hear it in code. You'll hear this term, cooperative federalism. And for those of us who went to law school, you kind of know what that means, but when it's used by this administration, what it means is we're going to get the federal government out of the business of doing X, Y, Z, and the states will just pick up the slack, or the municipalities will pick up the slack, knowing full well that a lot of the states really don't have the capacity to pick up the slack, and a lot of municipalities don't either. So when you hear this term cooperative federalism, it goes to the who question, which is, we don't know who else is going to do this important stuff. We just know that the federal government should not be in the business of doing it.
When I thought about infrastructure, because it affects all three of the areas in the presentations, and we saw right at the end, Sandra, talking about pipeline and talking about opening up some of these lands, particularly for drilling and for other things to provide natural resources. Can there be an argument, and I kind of feel the optimistic view on this is, can there be an argument that when left to devices, the people who are working in the industries can come up with efficient and more cost-effective and and environmentally friendly ways to extract those resources without the old way of saying, well, this is no longer a park, dig. You know, the concept of, are there ways to extract those natural resources that aren't necessarily changing policy or giving back land or messing with the Great Lakes or polluting our air?
I think there is. I think that we're smart enough as a country to come up with ways to extract the oil and the gas in ways that aren't as damaging. But I don't know that there's any motivation to do so, because if the regulations can be set aside, then you don't have to come up with the innovation. And of course, some companies are. Some companies are thinking about ways to do it cleaner because they'll figure out that eventually the cleaner is cheaper. But on the whole, I think that they're being given what they say they want, which is shareholder dividends.
If I could jump in a bit on that, so I should make a comment on free markets, given that I'm a University of Chicago economist. But
You scratched what I just said.
no. So part of the issue here, again, thinking about what's the motivation, is that so offshore drilling, for example, has been pretty good at self-policing after the oil spill in the Gulf a few years ago. There was this is potentially true for many industries, that they could self-police, but if the regulatory environment is not right, then they're not going to have the right incentives. So I mentioned this issue of the social cost of carbon, a price on carbon, something like that. Currently, the idea would be coming from one side of the political spectrum, saying the free market is, we're not going to intervene in this, and you can emit carbon in whatever way you want. We know through science and research that there is a price to each unit of those emissions, and that's a market failure. We're subsidizing. So it's already a distorted market. Everyone here, through their health, through the health of everybody, through their labor productivity, is subsidizing power production in a way that we shouldn't be. So the market is already distorted. So there's this idea of free market being zero intervention. That's not quite true. Here, there's already a distorted market which needs to be intervened in to create the correct market.
Yeah. Cam, last question, and we get to Q&A. We want to, I'm plenty of time. We're killing it here. When we talk about the free market, okay, let's talk about self-policing. If you're in a situation where Lake Michigan, let's take for example, a company, nameless, BP, drops chromium in the lake. Are we in a position yet, and you've been a conservationist, you've an advocate, you've worked in the Obama administration, you've seen this at all levels. As a society, are we at the point where our habits can be the self-policing, can be the regulation? If a company that is putting something in our drinking water, and it's widely publicized, that we boycott that company, that company no longer is the place that we stop to get our gasoline or whatever it might be. Is there any value in the fact that as consumers, we have a voice?
I think in some ways that's the most powerful motivator and dynamic out there. But what I think of, Justin, is what damage can be caused in the intervening time between when the public becomes educated, when the public figures out what they can do to vote with their dollars and where, and then the damage that's caused,
late, right?
And it becomes too late. So that's why I'm a big believer in having lots of fail-safes and checks. They may be inconvenient sometimes, they may be burdensome sometimes, but you have lots of different kinds of safety nets here so that we don't see what has happened in instances like Love Canal or Flint, Michigan, or what have you.
The other question I thought about, Amir, when you were doing your presentation was, okay, let's say that we do invest, or that the lack of regulations, and you've kind of already answered this in a way that diffuses this, but let's say that there is innovation. We see this maybe in solar energy or other places where there's innovation that comes from the fact that there isn't regulation. It's working from this administration's idea of getting rid of regulation so innovation can thrive, starts to work. But it has unintended consequences, meaning a new energy comes in, and we don't, we're now being able to get energy from apples, but the apple cores actually ruin our environment, right? That's the concept. Hypothetically, without those regulations in place, we can't let the apple producers be the ones that say, oh, we're ruining the environment, sorry, we'll stop, because money's on the line. And they continue to do that. I mean, they will continue to, money seems to beat out the fact of any sort of regulation or self-policing from any of these. And why would it be any different in new emerging technologies?
That's true. We would hope that for the fail-safes on other aspects of the production process as we're making a solar panel will reduce harmful pollutants that will come from that. So as long as they exist, then maybe we're okay. But it is, underlying this is an issue of thinking about the uncertainty about the future. I showed that figure saying maybe we're okay, that we'll reduce emissions because gas is cheaper than anyone expected it to be, and the market is going to take over. So the issue there is that we can't rely on the market to provide that stability in the long run. And it's the same with your question about technology. There's going to be uncertainty in any of these things that we need to plan for, and the way Cam's mentioning, to have the fail-safes up front. I can't say that in 2030 the gas prices are going to be the same as now. I have suspicion to believe they might be, but who knows what will happen. No one saw fracking coming in the way that we did. No one saw solar PV dropping because China invested massively in it to the price it is now. So there's a broader question of uncertainty about what the future is going to hold for us that makes just relying on our self-policing or the market or general economic trends to take care of these problems, it makes it a bit of a risky proposition.
Well, I guess it goes to the concept of getting the private sector involved. Cam, you mentioned that, and that always makes it gives me pause when you start talking about natural resources like water, because if a private sector gets involved and they're like, I think it should be cherry, what's going to stop? We've seen it in the movie Idiocracy where, that's the concept. It's just more of a documentary than it is a comedy. But this concept of, and even when we talk about surge pricing in this way of using private sector concepts, what do we have to look out for? Because if you offer up, we've seen it in Chicago with the parking meter deal and the subsidies to say, and even what we see in the toll roads, those are private roads, and when they want to raise the cost, they raise the cost. What do we have to look out for as a society when it comes to letting the private sector in these kind of resource issues?
Right. So I think the things we have to look out for are those kinds of scenarios that you're talking about, where you privatize a public asset, and that's not what I want to see happen. What I am talking about, though, in ways in which the private sector, which is different than privatization, private sector being involved is through innovation. When you take a look at, and I thought Amir's graphic was great, having the Clean Power Plan in place would have been very helpful. But were we starting in a better trend anyway in terms of coal burning based energy? Yes, we were. Would we be getting to our goals anyway? I think we would have. Maybe faster with the Clean Power Plan in place, but because we are driving towards renewables, which is as much coming from the private sector, if not even more, than because we are using a regulatory-based system to get there. I think that there is a very powerful force there. How that gets harnessed to help water and other natural resources, that's the key question.
Let's open it up to the floor. You guys in? You guys down for some questions? Let's get the microphone out, and I'll let you guys decide who's going to be first, things like that. All right, sound good? We got our hand up here. There you go. Go ahead and say your name and
Sure.
affiliation.
Alan Mellis, former Director of Planning for the Forest Preserve District, Cook County.
Great.
But I'm here just as a citizen. So this is a question I have that I always wondered about. So last week in a newspaper, it said Lake Michigan is getting clearer. The water's getting clearer. And it didn't necessarily say that was a good thing or not. So we have, well, let me just finish. And we have the threat of Asian carp. And I never read, and we dealt with Asian carp, if that'll make, having Asian carp in Lake Michigan, will that make water cleaner? So my question is, how do you balance clean water against, say, the fishing industry, which seems to be the contrast?
Sure. Well, what the Trib article was really pointing to is what is the water being cleaned, from, or what's it being rid of? And sure, it could look cleaner and clearer, but if what's coming out of the water is basically food for fish, then you're essentially looking at vodka, or something like that, and you're sterilizing the lake, and that's not what you want. You want natural water is not supposed to, you're not supposed to see 30 feet down, at least in the Great Lakes. There's food in there that helps feed an ecosystem. That's not what you want coming out of a water. That's not pollution.
Okay. What do we got up front?
Hi, thanks. My name's Virginia. I'm with the Chicago Democratic Socialists of America. I'm a grassroots environmental justice organizer, not professionally affiliated with any agency or anything. My question was mostly for Amir. When you were talking about positive things that we might be seeing with targets being at the state level already being hit because of free market forces. You said that some places will not get to see these benefits, and we know that historically poorer communities of color are more affected by environmental issues, and that's been the case, before a year from now, long before Trump was in office. And what is my question? I guess I could open it up to all three of you. But what is to be done for these communities that already don't have the same power to organize at the grassroots level and fight for their communities, like you've seen in Love Canal? How do you see communities that have already been disenfranchised being able to come together?
That's a good question.
So just on the issue that I meant about the Clean Power Plan was that there was this trading mechanism built in. So if I, as a state, do really well in reducing emissions, I can trade that with a state that's doing really badly, and there's some kind of equalization that may or may not happen because of that. The issue of environmental justice is a whole other kettle of fish. There's generally this issue that, and it's observed all over the world with any indicator of environmental quality, from Latin America and poorer households living in more landslide-prone land, for example, to people, to lower income people in the US living kind of downwind of power plants or manufacturing plants. And that's because the housing prices are cheaper there. So we get this multiplier of any environmental effect we think about, particularly with air pollution, that not only is it affecting people badly if we remove the regulations, but it's affecting exactly the people who are most disenfranchised. And one of the worrying trends of the past year has been, I'm thinking broadly about externalities. I would call that an externality on those people. The people suffering from the externalities in production are the ones least being listened to by the administration. We're only hearing that the costs of regulation are too high, and that's fine, but we're not hearing from the people who are suffering the most, who are often the most disenfranchised people. The solution to that is something that, you could probably answer better than I could, but the general inequality of environmental impacts is something which, or even just climate change, air pollution as an inequality issue, is something that we don't talk about as much. And reframing it in that way would probably be a good first step towards dealing with the problem, showing this is much more of a justice issue than it is just purely one of where's the appropriate place to site your economic production.
No, and I've read 2 books for the show in the last month about how Chicago over 100 years' time has had this issue, whether it's the stockyards and everything that was happening in stockyards and the communities that were surrounding that in the turn of the century, to Ben Austin just did a great book on Cabrini Green, and how they called the near north side, the branch of the Chicago River, Smoky Hollow, in the 30s or 20s and 30s, because they were just dumping pet coke and chemicals from those industries along that river, and people lived there. That's what Cabrini Green was brought in to replace the slums that were completely victim of environmental injustices. So, I mean, it's something that Chicago has a long history with, and you'd be surprised. I mean, I would assume that that's a big part of what you've dealt with, Cam, over your career.
Yeah, and so I wanted to, Justin, just add on to what Amir said. You know, this is why this federal deregulation is so important, is because when you leave the states or the municipalities to their own devices, it's only a matter of time before the level of protection, you know, varies, and you get this patchwork quilt out there of different protection levels. You know, the federal is supposed to maintain a minimum baseline for everybody, and that is intended to help ensure that we don't, over time, find ourselves repeating history, getting communities that are much more disproportionately impacted than others.
All right, we got any other questions? Here we go. We got Mike's there. Wow, we're getting efficient here.
Good afternoon. My name is Adrian Ermer, and I'm technically affiliated with myself. I'm a candidate for elected office. So my question is very policy focused. This notion of collaborative federalism is interesting because you think collaboration, there's two willing partners in this, but really what ends up happening is that we're forced to fill a gap in very critical services. The district that I hope to represent includes part of the 10th Ward, which is having extreme manganese and pet coke issues. We have air quality control monitors that aren't being monitored because of these cuts. So I'm wondering if you have any examples of policies or states that have acted quickly enough to start to fill that gap, and if there's any, you know, projection on anticipated outlays that states like Illinois are going to have to be considering come budget time in order to fill those gaps.
Well, thanks, Adrian. No, I haven't seen a state really step up. California, and that much. California comes to mind as helping in some areas. The other thing that's been intriguing to me is seeing some of the attorney generals step forward in the states to try to slow, if not halt, some of the deregulatory initiatives that we're seeing coming out of Washington.
I have a question about that. I was thinking about that today. I was listening to WBEZ this morning, and they had Chris Kennedy on, talking about
Aren't you only supposed to listen to WGN?
Yeah, exactly. It was on commercial. But my question is that you don't have the issues that all three of you are addressing are not at the forefront of this gubernatorial election. And you're not, again, all we're hearing about is budgets and state, and not even in a way, now we're just really, it's personality politics. But when we talk about the issues that were just raised in the 10th, that manganese, which is a huge issue and continues, and we talk about Asian carp, I mean, it seems like there would be a space for candidates to prioritize these issues, especially since they're on the forefront of everybody who lives here. Nobody's got anything to say about that?
I'll give a very speculative well, I'm not sure. But part of the reason is that a lot of environmental problems, which I think came across from everybody's talk, are very long-term. It doesn't fit in with a typical political time cycle. And so that's, I'm not going to make my whole career as a politician talking purely about climate change, deferring climate change damages in 100 years' time. Nobody wants to hear that. There's more pressing things. And I think that's kind of what's happened in the past year. We have this constant set of pressing problems that are taking precedence because there's the longer term aspect of what we're talking about.
Yeah, I mean, conservation work, environmental work is a long haul issue. And you can say, I support parks, I like parks, I can advocate for parks, but when the budgets get tight, people will say, well, you know, the trees are still there and there's a place for my kids to play. I'm really going to focus over here, over here, over here, not really thinking about the economic benefits of parks and the quality of life issues and the environmental issues that help, you know, give us refuges where there is something green and healthy, something that helps to clean our air. And it's, you know, politicians aren't looking at the long haul. The people who work and the people who love the places are looking at the long haul.
And in addition to what Sandra says, I think it's also, we have to get better at our communications too. So when you talk about the environment, it sounds like something that's out there. When you talk about climate change, it sounds like it's something that's up there. You know, talking in terms of childhood asthma rates is something that we should be talking about, almost as kind of a surrogate for climate change. That helps people understand why these issues are important and how they're linked to them economically and health-wise.
All right.
Yeah.
You go.
I'm Mary Eggert, and I'm with Global Waterworks. We were formed because we learned, does anyone know about the 2030 study here?
Yes.
The 20, good for you. Okay, Justin, what does the 2030 study show?
Well, I don't know what it shows, but I know that the study has been made, right?
Okay, it basically shows, okay, for every 5 people here in the room, 3 of you will have a glass of water in 2030 who want one across the globe. It's a study by the World Bank and by McKinsey, and it looks at the water crises and, whoa, Cape Town, we have it. But it's just a signal of what's going to happen with these extreme weather events. And what we haven't heard discussed here today, which I think is the glaring gap in these conversations, and I love all you policymakers and advocates, but millions of advocates have been out there for decades suggesting we should be environmentally friendly, suggesting we should save water. But today we have the data, we have the satellites, we have robotics, we have the visibility to do the real-time water monitoring, that policing of a factory. A bunch of mommies could spend $20,000 and SCAN's technology can read out the exact pollutants of that manufacturer. And the big private water companies said, wouldn't that be nice if the real world knew what was possible today to get a handle on groundwater everywhere? We have a Well-Intel groundwater monitoring, gives you real-time visibility of any little well you could have. So we don't have to be surprised anymore. I work with, we helped launch the Smart Water Networks Forum, which Danielle helped lead a panel on, and that was in Chicago here. Chicago gave birth to that with current water, and the technologies we have available. This is an aha for your show. There's a tort law in Illinois. Oh, sorry. So the question is, why don't we get in the technology connected to provide the answers so that the climate change cost is evident and we avoid that cost? Sorry.
No, I think, I mean, we have technology. I mean, we can put a webcam on a giraffe, right? And we can all go crazy to watch a giraffe. But there's something to be said about technology and advances in the ability to monitor. Is there a way for private sector monitoring or to have a better understanding of how the companies in all of your respective areas operate?
I'll leap on one thing connected to the question of environmental justice. So we've talked about budgets and how the decreasing budgets of the EPA, for example, would lead to less ability to monitor, and exactly the places that will monitor less will be the places where people are most vulnerable because they're most exposed and probably lower income. It's not really a sexy topic, but measurement is what basically my whole life is about. Learning to measure things properly and making sure they are measured is incredibly important. So I agree with the idea that we should, that should be a general goal, not just within academia, public, but also in private sectors. There is a market for some kind of water quality testing and for other things and for air monitors. The issue is that, again, probably, at least I think, related to how pertinent it is for now, a lower income household is less likely to think about that and have the expensive outlay for a monitor when they are considering other things, if they've got higher health costs, for example, and not necessarily collecting those to the environment. So it's definitely a place for not just the private sector, but for an innovation to step in that would subsidize kind of citizen monitoring in some way, or encourage citizen monitoring, which would have enormous benefits for justice, I think.
Great. Any more questions? Rock and roll. All right. Right up front.
Can I do cleanup? Sure. Hi, everyone. Mary Subarad, President of the Metropolitan Planning Council. Thank you, everyone, for being here. Since you, our panelists, helped us see the momentum that is behind this devolution moment that we're in on a whole host of issues, and Justin, you commented on the fact that the gubernatorial candidates are not focusing a lot of attention and the public dialogue is not. I want to bounce that back to the panelists to ask, if the Metropolitan Planning Council were to have a forum with the gubernatorial nominees, as we have done each of the last 4 cycles, what questions would you like to pose to our future Illinois leaders for governor?
Sure, I see everybody leaning that way so that I have the mic. Okay, so, you know, a lot of us in the room, we're water people, or we're air people, or we're land people. We all come to it with a certain angle and a history and things like that. I think, Mary Sue, one of the questions that I would try to get, I'm not going to try to fashion the exact question in my head, but I would try to get at something that covers all of them. And that can mean a budget question. That can mean posing a question to them about, instead of, you know, what cuts would you make, how would you try, what would your goals be, and how would you try to achieve them given our state's fiscal state? And get inside their minds about how they think, whether it's a priority for them, and how they would try to effectuate getting to those kinds of goals. I would try to craft a question or two, maybe more like that than about Asian carp or, say, you know, sewage treatment or ozone pollution or something like that. No, back to you guys.
My turn. I think largely similar to what you're saying. I would be interested in knowing where in the list of priorities it actually comes, trying to force a response saying, you know, why are there 10 things above environmental issues broadly, and particularly within the set of environmental issues, my own interest is largely in climate change. How do they view, in the context of those priorities, Chicago adhering to climate action and the influence of that, or sorry, Illinois adhering to some kind of climate action target and the influence that that might have, whether they view that as an important issue at all, as a first stage in understanding why it hasn't been central to a debate.
Well, I'm in a good position because I don't live in Illinois, and so I can ask any question. But I would ask that when you are dealing with, when you think about the legacy you want to leave, who are you bringing to the table when you make those decisions? Whose advice do you take? Because I want to know who's at the table. I want to know if it's only industry or if it involves many, many other groups of people.
One more question, host prerogative. Cam, I appreciate that you ended on this note of optimism, and we have the image of the Great Lakes, and whether you're a Republican in Ohio or a Democrat in Illinois, there seems to be consensus that protecting 20% of the world's available fresh water seems like a smart thing to do. I'm curious to know, one, if you have another note of potential optimism, and then Amir and Sandra. We want everyone to go back to the rest of the Thursday feeling good about life. What do you see as a sign out there? Potential positives, either in the federal policy proposals or response that you're seeing from
Yeah.
the local?
No, I'm really glad you asked the question, Josh. Honestly, I think that, again, we think in terms of issues. But if you step outside of that box for a minute, what you see right now is people being active in ways they have not been for generations. Having done this for 30 years, I have not seen this. And to me, that is the thing that not just gives me optimism, but I actually think it's going to save the day. We are activating. The complacency is our biggest enemy.
I'll do the boring note as the researcher on the panel. I made this point about Chicago being a potential beacon in terms of the learning that can happen here. I put up those maps of climate change impacts, and Chicago's in a bit of a Goldilocks zone. There's enough of an impact that we will get benefits by taking action, but it's not like we're Miami, where sea levels are rising and there's this very implacable opponent coming for us in the next 100 years. The way that I think as a researcher that beacon status can be maintained and spread is through thinking of the learning, and a lot of people in this room are doing a lot of these things, thinking of the learning and doing some rigorous research on it to make it generalizable, to say, here's the lessons we learned in this place, and try to make sure that we share that beyond. And that's a step that probably everyone can take, thinking a little bit through not just making something a Chicago issue, but looking at Chicago issues as representative of other things that we can do within the United States and other parts of the world.
My note of optimism is similar to Cam's, in that I think more people have been activated in the last year to become seriously involved in advocating for parks the lands for conservation. And I think that the old 1975, 1980, think globally, act locally, I think is really what's going to be put into play. I see it in Nebraska where I live, that we are spending more time, elected officials are spending more time thinking about how to save large swaths of land so that we have this legacy as a mediating force for increasing development. And I didn't see that 5 years ago. And I don't think it's only just a response to this, but as a member of the National Park Conservation Association, the last year has been banner for membership through the roof, because people want to stand up in parks.
Give it up for Sandra Washington, Amir Gina, and Cameron Davis. Amazing. I want to bring up Lynn McClure. I want to thank you guys. Thanks for having me. We're going to bring up Lynn, and then we'll be done here. But again, this conversation continues, so thank you very much.
Thanks, Justin. Lynn McClure, National Parks Conservation Association. Josh, remind me not to close. Again, table's been set. I'm supposed to be positive and leave everybody with a great feeling. One trend, I think, that's undeniable over the last year that ties into not just these 3 topics, but the rest of the series that MPC is going to host is that the administration doesn't look to all of us for advice or input in the way that has been done previously in cutting back, formal comment periods, the place where Cam and I have spent a lot of our lives wallowing, and Josh and others in here as well, eliminating federal advisory panels. I'm fortunate that I'm still a federal advisor in one of the, I think, 15 panels out of nearly 100 that was saved. But when you take what these people have said about the ability to activate and have your voice heard, there's congressional staff here who will say your voices are heard, and they really are. You have to make that difference. So even if the doors aren't open and the normal portals aren't there to make it heard, we're all creating our own. So I think that is a good note. MPC will be having 2 more of these. They're wonderful and they'll be vital, and we always love partnering with them. Thanks so much, Josh and Mary Sue and the rest of the staff for putting this together. Thank you again to the panelists, and have a great day.